Welcome back. I'm glad to have you here. So this is our last full week before we get into the break next week for the holidays. If you're traveling, safe travels next week. If you're sticking around, I think you have a good chance to focus and do what you need to do. So, if you'd like, you can take a deep breath. I want to give you something that might give you a sigh of relief to start things out for class. So, I'm offering you an extended due date on your term paper. So, if you want to get it done by Friday and turn it in by Friday, you still can, especially if you want to compartmentalize and just be done. I didn't want to encroach or cut on your break next week. However, I'm willing to accept it without any sort of late penalty if you turn it in at the latest by midnight next Wednesday, November 24th. Doing that for a couple reasons, and it's been a really long and challenging quarter for a lot of you. Adjusting back to classes, face-to-face, juggling so much else, so I know that it's been a really hard time. I also know that in terms of this project, I've talked to a lot of people who are kind of at the stage of still trying to brainstorm and figure out which topic to develop. So I'd like to give you more time to do that rather than rushing into a topic that you're less interested in doing. And I'm also going to be honest and say that after Friday, when the break starts, I'm not going to be grading them right away anyway. So I figure the extra time can help you out. Again, I don't want to encroach on your break next week, but you can use that additional time if you'd like to. You can still turn it in by Friday if you would like for full credit as well. So that option is available for you. So I will accept any sort of rough drafts or outlines if you get them to me by the end of this week. So by Friday, I can still give you some feedback on those. So at this point, I also wanted to see, given that update, if there's any questions that folks have about the essay, including kind of format, style, structure, anything like that.
If we want you to read over an essay before we turn it in, we just email it to you?
Yep. Yeah, just email it to me. You can email an outline, full draft. One thing that I've been doing is for folks who send it as a Google Doc, I'll add inline comments as well. So send it in the format that works best for you. Google Doc is actually easier for a draft, so I can provide direct comments. But if there's another format, you can submit it through that too. So yeah, so again, it's a chance for you to look at a case study or topic related to conflict and conflict management. So I know that it's taken a little bit of time to prepare, so I want to kind of help get you some more flexibility. So last class, we wrapped up with our final study circle. So study circle number 4 was focused on how we source our energy. Some really interesting discussion about some of the pros and cons of different types of both non-renewable and renewable energy sources. So that does it for our study circles. I'm going to kind of debrief them overall in a little bit. So this class, we'll talk through that. Again, I'll have a couple other pointers and things to help you out as you're crystallizing your topic and getting going on your draft for your term paper. And then I want to talk a little bit about mediation. So mediation gets into chapter 7 of JANT, and it's another style of conflict management, kind of drawing from our discussion before the exam about negotiation that can help you as you're working on your final draft and in general in the class. Again, a few kind of quick reminders about this term paper. So it's 2,000 words, so it averages out to about 4 pages, give or take. So that's 2,000 words of content. One easy way to handle this in something like a Google Doc or Microsoft Word is to highlight all of your text and see its character and word count. That's an easy way to see how you're doing on that. So that's 2,000 words plus whatever introduction, like title slide stuff you have, or any works cited that you have. You don't need to include a title page, but you can if you want to. But that would not count toward your word total. Again, standard font margins, all of that good stuff. Remember that you should be citing neither APA, MOA, or Chicago. Pick the one that works best for you. Let me know if you need any help. I have linked that Purdue OWL, which has a lot of examples to help you with citing sources. The things that you might be citing for this rough draft would include Jan, as well as any specifics, like the forms of evidence from the conflict itself. So say you were looking at something like the Camp David Accords. Maybe there's a special on the History Channel that talks about that negotiation process, and you could cite from that. So cite from the supporting evidence that you're using in your case study. If it's not common knowledge, it's a good idea to cite it. And then also from your Jan textbook. Remember that the goal of this is not to argue your opinion or your position on the topic. I don't want or need to know how you personally feel about the topic. I want an explanation about the conflict because of how it's happening. So remember that you can focus on case studies or examples. One thing that I'm noticing a lot in folks that I've talked to is that the topics people are interested in are interesting but are very broad. So my advice if you're struggling with the topic is to focus on the things that are really intriguing to you. So for instance, right, topic of how we source our energy was a really good study circle topic for people to explore. But within that larger issue, maybe you're focusing on conflict or disagreement surrounding the use of solar energy, including the ways that it can be beneficial, but also the ways that it kind of can have some toxic materials, or the way that a lot of solar tax credits and so on have not been used especially well. So you might look into that specific form of energy and look at discussions surrounding that. You could look at a specific case, like a court case, right? So there's examples, of course, of a lot of landmark cases over the years, Brown versus Ford, and so on. Or you could look at a more contemporary example too, right? For instance, there, of course, have been very public cases and trials, both surrounding George Floyd, the current case with Kyle Rittenhouse, right? So there's a lot of examples to look at, right? So you could also look at topics or issues that you want to explore in more detail. So again, issues of agricultural or land management are ones that a lot of people have jumped out at and been especially interested in. I think one thing that will help to focus your topic is to think about location or situation. So for instance, the state of Oregon and its policies toward sort of land acquisition or management. Or maybe you come from the state of Washington and you're interested in the way that its taxation works or something like that, right? There's a lot of different areas that you can focus on that are interesting. When I lived in California for a couple of years, there was a very major conflict surrounding a water pipeline and whether or not Southern California could have water taken from the northern side of the state during a drought. So there's like a lot of things that are specific to location or situation that you could look at too. Dan, I'm happy to help you boil down your topic if you need to. Recommend trying to get it as focused as you can. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the study circles, and now that they've happened overall, my impressions on how they went, on the ways that you will share your ideas, and kind of some general tips if you find yourself in sort of conflict management situation like this one in the future. You know, whether you're working a job, or you're asking people to work together, or address a conflict as a group, whether you have interest in like kind of formal mediation, whether you do that in the context of being like an RA or working in dorms or something like that. There's a lot of situations where we find ourselves engaging with conflict with other people, and so I wanted to take note of, I think, things that work well and things that you can continue to think about. As a reminder, you should turn in feedback on 2 other study circles by the end of the quarter. If you were not able to go to class for at least 2 other study circles, those recordings are available on Canvas. So you would just go to the date of one of the other study circles, watch the video and use that, or you can review it as a way of getting additional insights there. Remember that feedback is due by the end of the quarter and is an opportunity for you to share information about what you noticed from some of the other study circles in the class. The reflection, so many of you have already turned that in. That's due 2 weeks from the study circle date, and I'm asking you to use the ideas in conflict management that we've brought up to understand and apply to this situation. So, some of the things that stood out to me. First of all, I really liked the degree to which there was this kind of open discussion, and I think in a way that really maintained a good level of respect and civility, right? There wasn't a I don't think that there were any moments that stood out to me as being like personal attacks or really like not very respectful toward others, especially as we dealt with some challenging topics related to things like minimum wage, energy, and so on, right? That's not always the case. As of course we've seen over the last several years, a lot of civil disagreement gets really challenging. But I think overall people did a great job of maintaining some kind of levels of support and listening to one another. One thing is that you might have noticed, especially early on, in many of your group discussions, that people were generally on really similar pages. And I think some of that might just be in general, people having similar positions on the topics, but it's also a symptom of groupthink. So one thing that I would challenge you to do as you continue to work forward in other situations like this one is to engage in even more strategies that can help to avoid groupthink. One way to do this is to have people kind of poll their opinions in an anonymous way in the beginning, right? Have somebody write down their opinion on the topic. How do you want to source your energy as a percentage in the beginning of class? Or do something such as getting outsider perspectives outside of class if you're ever actually dealing with a conflict scenario and you want to bring somebody new in. So keep thinking about the ways that groupthink can create this idea that everybody believes similarly on a topic, right? There were a lot of situations where it seemed like, your group members felt kind of the same, but that might not have always been the case. Or you might have kind of refrained from sharing your perspective for the interest of the group. So that's just something to keep thinking about. It's very hard to deal with, right? It's a very common trend that tends to come up. I felt like there was a good opportunity for everybody to speak. I didn't feel like there was a complete domination of one person in any of the study circles. There was definitely an open forum where people could talk about and address issues that came up, especially for people that might be in a facilitator type of role. One thing that I encourage is continuing to do kind of active strategies of saying, hey, I haven't heard from you in a minute. Would you like to address this topic, or do you have anything to add? So don't be afraid to call out specific people or to ask for specific perspectives if you're interested in engaging everybody and you're noticing that there are some gaps there in how much certain people are communicating. It can be awkward, right, to do something like to call out, but it actually can help out to make that person feel watched or feel heard. Sometimes people feel more comfortable if they're explicitly given the floor to speak and might otherwise be apprehensive. I feel like people had some pretty good and productive approaches to the conflicts too, right? The way that, for instance, you kind of had this widening of perspective on the minimum wage study circle, where people more and more got to speak about their positions on the topic. Or on standardized testing, right? There was a better understanding of the differences that people came from. One thing to continue to think about is that because these were more designed for like understanding and discussion, you might have a lot of like professional applications where you're actually needing to develop a common goal or a solution. For instance, if you're working with coworkers and you've interviewed candidates and you're deciding, okay, who do we hire for this job, right? Then that can be a really big challenge in developing common goals. Is figuring out, okay, we got to pick somebody at the end of this. How are we going to make that decision? So I didn't ask you for this assignment to make a final decision or recommendation on the issue. I didn't say, by the end of the study circle, you should have an agreement on what to do about standardized testing. But you might think about for the future some of the tactics you might employ in order to make a solution be reached if needed. So those were some general things that I noticed. Again, I wanted to do this as a way of thinking about and applying things from the class and giving you some practical application in conflict management. So, I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about mediation. Today and Wednesday's class are going to be focused on unpacking mediation as a strategy of dealing with conflict management. So, to kind of start things out, we have to think about what mediation is and what makes mediation different from another type of conflict management such as coercion or negotiation, which we talked about earlier. So what makes negotiation different from something like mediation, right, is that mediation is specifically involving a third party. So what a third party is Depends a lot on culture and situation. For instance, in some cultures, right, such as Western cultures, there's a prioritization of a mediator being a third party, being a detached person, an outsider, right, who comes in and offers like an objective and unbiased perspective on the issue. In other cultures, a third party is somebody that's trusted from the inside. So either way, mediator is a third party. It's somebody who is not one of the major people in conflict. They facilitate communication. So facilitation is about enabling and allowing communication to take place in a constructive way with other people. And disputing parties, right, parties who are in some level of disagreement, the number of people in conflict could look really different depending on the culture, the mediation style, or the situation. So in more Western approaches, there are generally two people in conflict in a lot of situations of mediation. But in a lot of other cultures and situations, including many non-Western cultures, there's many sides of the conflict and many parties that might be in disagreement with each other. And the idea of a mutually beneficial solution is an important one too, right? A cycle of mediation is not just about trying to get one person to be the winner or the loser, but instead an ideal mediator is trying to help everybody get something out of it. So does the mediator make decisions on how to resolve the conflict? That is, does the mediator ultimately decide what they're going to do to solve the conflict? How many folks think yes? No? Correct. The mediator is not the decider, right? The mediator helps people to make a decision, but you can think about the role of the mediator as essentially the person that creates the conversation or the space that allows people who are discussing with each other to reach that decision in and of itself. In other words, think about mediation as negotiation, but with a third party that's guiding the discussion and guiding the conversation. So the mediator does not listen to everybody talking and say, here's the solution, here's what we should do. One thing that a good mediator might do is they could entertain possible solutions. They could say, well, it seems like you two have some discussions about custody that are important. Have you looked at something like an every other week situation? They might pose or test out an idea, but they're not going to command people to do that. So that's an important distinction as we're making sense of mediation overall. So, there's also different views on the perspective of power. And mediation can be especially challenging given the relinquishing of power that happens. So, depending on sort of religious or cultural views, many people, such as Quakers, take the perspective that it's a virtue or a good thing to relinquish or give up power. In the case of mediation, right, mediating is giving up power and authority to the facilitator to create that discussion or space to talk about the conflict. So it's shifting it from everybody having some sort of power or say in negotiation strategies and tactics, and shifting it toward creating that neutral space for people to talk. So one of the ways that we can kind of distinguish the different types of ways that culture factors in to different styles of mediation is to contrast a couple examples. So the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service, you might have read about for this week, is an example of employing a Western strategy of conflict management and mediation. For instance, the FMCS and similar, like Western-focused styles of mediation have a few key assumptions. One of them, right, is that every conflict would have two sides to it. So you have two people in disagreement, in a couples counselor situation, and the two people are going to work together in order to reach a solution. The idea, again, that a mediator is a neutral third party is one that a lot of Western cultures see as really important. They want somebody who's unbiased and so on. And another really interesting distinction is that in a lot of Western cultures, in approaches like this one, the mediation itself is supposed to be completely confidential. So in other words, Mediation is not something the public should see. It's something that privately people are working on together. And maybe once they have a solution or reach an agreement, it's something that's reached publicly. Right? So I saw the kind of long-running news anchor, Brian Williams, was kind of making the decision to leave his job. But it sounded like it was a very behind closed doors, long mediation and negotiation process where he was being asked to leave his current anchoring position. So that would be an example of how a lot of Western cultures tend to use private mediation that might lead to a more public result. So I want to show you a short video from the FMCS, which is an example of how they engage in mediation strategies, including the use of things like interest bargaining. So as a communication person, looking at some of the advertisements in circulation from groups such as the FMCS is really interesting to me. Like the words that they used as they were advertising and describing things like interest bargaining, which of course we talked about in the last week or two, right, is an example of things such as mutual gain, having intervention, and having like facilitation, developing skills. Like there was this very kind of practical and market-focused approach that FMCS uses, and I think a lot of forms of Western-style mediation use too. There's a focus on developing solutions that allow the workplace culture to be productive or engaged. So, when we look at some non-Western examples, including the ways that many indigenous cultures have approached the issue of mediation, there are some really big differences in the kind of approach and strategy. So for many Pacific Islanders, including Native Hawaiian populations, right, there's this sort of approach to conflict as reinforcing and rebuilding strength among people in the group. The prayer, "I'm sorry, I love you, please forgive me, thank you," is used as a kind of maxim or belief for how conflict is engaged. So a lot of other non-Western approaches take on a similar role. That is, that mediation is a kind of reparative and community-based approach in order to get the different groups to work together. So compared to Western styles, a lot of non-Western and indigenous styles of conflict management suggest a few key things. First of all, that a conflict oftentimes can and will have more than two people. So, of course, having a bigger conflict is a much messier conflict, but there maybe are more active situations where people have a lot of different ideas and opinions to bring to the table. Another idea here in many non-Western approaches is that instead of the mediator being an outsider, it should be somebody that's trusted, but is an insider in terms of the conflict and an understanding of the culture more generally. One way to think about this is that a lot of more non-Western and collectivist cultures tend to be higher context, right? There's a lot more subtext or ambiguity members of the culture might experience. So messages are not as clear, and there tend to be just greater needs for clarity and understanding among members of the group. And then another assumption is that mediation should be public. If mediation is seen as a community-wide act and meant to restore the good of the group, then it logically follows that people in the group and involved in the public more generally should be able to participate and be involved in the conflict. So I wanted to show another example that I think helps to emphasize some of the non-Western style of conflict management in South Sudan, and I think this is a good example of how these different approaches are incorporated.
Sort of indigenous processes, thinking about reconciliation. Could you share with us a little bit of what that means, perhaps in the context of South Sudan, some of the tribal chiefs, what their process is? And there's a second question to that, I'm kind of wondering, because classically we think of religious conflict being between different groups, but I would imagine in the peace building enterprise that peace builders would face strong resistance within their group. Those who see things going a different way. In other words, you may be moving toward a reconciliation with the rest of the group seems resistant.
Starting off with indigenous methodologies, and of course, the different cultures of the world have many different ways of doing that, but if you go and sit and learn from each one, you can see what has been their methodology. And so that's basically what I did when I was supporting, just from a logistical standpoint, a Nuer intra-conflict that they resolved themselves using their own methods. I was so amazed by that. I had never seen anything quite like that happen, and so I did my PhD on that to learn more. And when I did that, I actually traveled with a Nuer academic, and we went into the bush, sitting under the tree all day long, just people telling the stories of what they believe and how they resolve conflicts and how their ancestors had passed on this wisdom for them. But just a concrete example, the difference between the West and, for instance, the Dinka and the Nuer. Now, both of these tribal groups, the largest two in southern Sudan, these are known as acephalous societies. A means no, and cephalous means head. So they have no hierarchy. It is non-hierarchical. So there are no paramount chiefs, there are no kings. It is a flat organization. There were custodians for the water, custodians for the air, custodians for the land, depending on whose conflict it was, as to who helped resolve it. Which meant they became masters at consensus and problem solving through consensus. But to do that takes a huge amount of time. Days of telling the stories and surfacing the issues. That is not a Western approach. Westerners usually want you to send a delegation who is authorized to decide for you and sit in smoke-filled rooms and sometimes be in very nice hotels and shuttle back and forth and maybe spend millions of dollars and then go back. But if you go back into that kind of setting, they don't accept that as having credibility.
I thought was kind of an interesting application, an example that I think contrasts some of the different approaches to conflict management. Again, a lot of non-Western approaches have other elements of cultural identity, such as the presence or absence of hierarchy within members of the group, the degree to which things like consensus building and so on are shared. And so as a result of that, a lot of non-Western cultures tend to be more focused on a public deliberation between members of the group who are more largely implicated by issues in mediation. So just some interesting applications on understanding both of these approaches. Again, there's not one that's necessarily more correct or less correct than another. It's just helpful to understand how, depending on the location, the makeup of an organization or group or nation, right, that the styles of mediation could look a little different. It's also a good idea to understand that there are different types of mediators too. So generally speaking, mediators can take on one of three roles. If you're an evaluative mediator, you're somebody who is evaluating or providing information that creates a possible solution. So for instance, somebody might list out the concerns that each party has, and based on those concerns and interests, help to reach a compromise. A facilitative mediator might be something similar to your study circles, where it's a more open discussion and dialogue among people in the group. And then lastly, transformative mediator is somebody that's creating opportunities to change the ways that people might communicate with each other. So when I was a student, I took a dialogue and cultural studies class. And as an example of transformative mediation, the professor would always cut us off whenever we used the word but to separate two different parts of a sentence. So for instance, if I were to say, I'm really excited about the quarter, but I'm really worried about managing everything, he would say, no, use the word and. Say, I'm really excited about the quarter and I'm worried about managing everything. So this was transformative mediation because he was forcing us to have to use that type of language differently. And as a result, it caused us to think about problems differently. Rather than see these things in opposition, it required us to say, okay, I'm feeling these things at once. These things are happening together. Because I'm feeling both excited and anxious, I can better understand solutions to manage the anxiety while focusing on what's going well. So transformative mediation can be a really constructive opportunity too, in order to engage in effective conflict management skills with one another. So what I want to do now, in the remaining 20 minutes or so that we have, is shift gears, and what I'd like you to do is find a small group with people that are sitting near you. It could be anywhere between like 3 and 5 or 6 people. You might pick a group that you've worked with in the past. And what I'd like you to do within your group is have one member who will write and type things such as your group members' names. You might also have somebody who's willing to share from your group. What I'd like you to do is find an example of an organization or group that is able to professionally handle mediation. So if you've got folks with devices who are able to just do some searches for like mediation organizations or groups, you can do a little bit of searching there. And then to report on the kinds of mediation that this group does and the types of mediators, again going back to these 3 examples, that we might expect to see within that organization or group. So you can pick any example that stands out to you, that's interesting. You're looking at professional mediators. So I'll give you a chance to work in your groups, and then after some time, I'll have some groups share what they've come up with in terms of mediation. You to look at an example of some sort of organization or group that does conflict management and get in contact with them. So maybe you decide that the one that you focused on for your group is the one you want to do for extra credit. You've already got a starting point there. So I'd like each group to go ahead and share the example that they chose and then some of the ways that they were able to find out what mediation they use and the types of mediators they would expect to see from the group. So let's start here with this group on this side. Pass it along to whoever wants to cut it.
So, our example here was we did RAs in the form. We thought that would be a good example. So the kind of mediation that this uses, it's more like between roommates. Sometimes it can be between coworkers, but typically it's with people in the room. And then the type of mediator you would see is typically a facilitator, because a lot of times the RAs are like encouraging people to work conflict out between themselves and create solutions. So for the most part, we use facilitators.
Yeah, I think an example of like an RA is interesting because a lot of the conflict management that has to happen is very like constant, right? You have to jump between, okay, these 2 people are disagreeing over the space, there's a noise complaint going on over here, like there's a lot of unique smaller scale conflicts, but there might be larger ones too about broader like university policy, dorm policy, and so on. So there's a lot of like different hats that I would imagine an RA needs to wear as they're going through a lot of these different requirements and challenges. So it's a good example here of helping us to understand so many different contexts in which mediation might come up, right? If you're talking to your RA and you feel like your RA is sort of against you or is not going to hear you out, right? you're probably a lot less likely to feel comfortable going out and speaking to an RA if you feel like they can't advocate or listen to you. So having that kind of neutral or starting point where you can feel heard or listened to will be an essential way for mediation to even happen. Let's hear from, I think we've got a couple of groups here. So we've got a middle group here in the front.
Yeah, so we found an organization called School Mediation in Indiana. They focus on neutral approach, parties fix it themselves, compromise disputes, they talk about really focusing on like employment, malpractice, business conflicts, etc. And they talk about themselves as being an alternative to going to the lawsuits. So, yeah, we talked about their style as being definitely Western style in terms of this is a very not public type of operation, focusing on two parties and with that neutral third party outsider to try to help.
Yeah.
The type of mediator that we thought we probably see would be evaluated, so trying to lay out that foundation basis of here's what we need to do.
Yeah. That's a really good example. So you might have noticed toward the beginning of the chapter that mediation in many ways was born because things like the courts and doing a lawsuit takes a lot of time, takes a lot of money, and takes a lot of stress. So you might have things like settlements out of court, but something such as mediation was a way that organizations and groups could resolve or deal with an issue that came up before it would escalate or get to that point. Courts are really slow and it takes a long time and energy to go through that process. Something like these types of alternatives to going through that are probably seen as a really good option. In cases like these, going to court is something we could see as a worst alternative to a negotiated agreement, right? If we can't come up with a solution that works together and makes everybody happy, we'll have to go to trial, and that could be awful. So it's a way that worst alternative to a negotiated agreement is oftentimes employed in mediation to avoid some of the messy lawsuits or problems that might come up. Let's hear from the group here on this side in the front.
Our example is couples counseling, and it's a Western approach to mediation because the couples and then the mediator, and it's a private instead of a public counseling, whatever you call it. And then it's got facilitative because they all share their time and evaluate it because they're trying to find a solution in common grounds with the argument or whatever's going on.
Yeah.
Transformative because it creates an opportunity to change the way that they communicate.
Yeah.
To the behaviors.
I really like the idea of incorporating all three of those styles there because depending on the approach, right, of somebody like a couples counselor, their conversation style is going to look really different, and so on. So I think you have some good points there. See, I think there's another group or two. Yes.
So we actually found a local example called the Asian Oregon Mediation Center, and they focus on reconciliation, settlement, and compromise. Some of the more specific things they have listed on their website that they are specialized in is neighbor to neighbor, animal disputes, landlord tenants, family relationships, and there's like a couple of more. And we decided that it was evaluative mediator because they like to things sit down and listen to what they have to say and give advice and what to do next. So.
Yeah. I really like too the like areas of specialization that could have, like in Eastern Oregon, like a recognition of, in a more rural community, what are the unique challenges or issues that might be more likely to come up, and therefore, what do we need to do to train professionals to deal with certain types of conflicts? So, context can matter a lot for what type of mediation, specialization, and information can be given. So these are some good examples. Did I get everybody? I think I did. Great. So these are some really good practical examples and applications of mediation in action. So to kind of wrap up for today, as a reminder, you've got that extra time to finish your essay. Friday's class is still going to be an optional. You can come in for some troubleshooting, questions, or just a quiet space to work. I'll be here. Remember, mediation is this third party who's not actively engaging in a decision, but is helping to facilitate the process. There's a lot of different cultural approaches at play too. For next class, keep working through chapter 7 if you have not already finished the chapter. and we'll continue to talk about mediated communication and conflict management. Go ahead and pass forward your assignment for today with your group members' names on it. Have a great Monday and rest of your week, and I will see you again on Wednesday.
Last Wednesday, I agreed to email you what like my topic was, my essay.
Yeah, submit that over tonight. Thank you.
How old he is, but 5 or 6 years ago, he had a sports crash during a dog trial and dog messed up.
Yes.
So yes. Then he was
Second.